We are lighting the candle, a world that works. And I'm Bill Correll, and I'm here with one of my favorite people on the planet to talk to, Jan Jeremias. We've been at this a little bit with just the two of us, a couple months, and it's fascinating because I just want you to know we had to interrupt another conversation that we were having to go ahead and record this. So we won't bother trying to recreate what we were talking about. However, we probably would be, remiss if we didn't talk about what we're starting to see and what we're learning from different reports that we see. And it's fascinating to me, Jan, that when you get into an area where someone is an expert on the subject and how they expound, I'm always a little bit skeptical when they talk in absolutes. You know what I mean? That when they say, we believe or we think or we're starting to see evidence that's starting to point in a direction, I have a lot more listening for somebody who's ready to say, I don't have the answers yet. And unfortunately, in several different things, we've had a lot of things that were stated and as problems. So I'll give you an example of something that happened to me this past week, if that works for you.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Bill.
So I'm known on Facebook with my crowd. My tribe knows me as somebody who does intermittent fasting. I eat primarily a keto diet. I have not had very much alcohol in 2024 at all. I had for 9 days when we were on the cruise. I drank like it was going out of style. Up to a degree. I did not ever, drink too much to wake up with a big head the next day. But other than that, I've had nothing since. And for most of the month of February, nothing before it. But my point here is that folks who know that I'm an intermittent faster, there was an article that was published um, through, I guess coincidentally it had to do with the American Heart Association had an annual conference or something, and there was evidence that was presented to the AHA having to do with side effects with people who limited their eating period. This is weird, okay? So the premise and the top line is that there's that limiting your eating period can double your propensity to have heart related disease. All right. So that sounds really scary on its face, right? You'd want to just like stop everything and go read about this. I can't remember. I can't believe that this was published. That headline was published in the American Heart Association journal. And it was because so many people saw it copied and pasted into different, like might have been with the news outlets, major networks, et cetera. So I went and I looked at what the information that they had. First of all, there was no study. There was nothing that was presented as conclusive. There
Hmm.
was no word of the may, no, that it will. Okay. Long story short, I went and I read down through it and I thought, well, so who did the study? I don't know. Where'd they get the data? Well, they mined data from self-reporting by 20,000 people over a 15-year period, et cetera. So don't damn me with my lack of exact facts, but this is the general idea. So I'm looking at it and I'm going, okay, what do we know about their diet? When they were doing this intermittent period of only eating for 8 hours a day? What were they eating when they were doing that? No information about that. How frequently did they fast for that period of time over that period? No information. They were basically saying they asked people to self-report over a 2-day period what their intake was over that 2-day period, and then they generalized from that. Now, here's the interesting part. When it came right down to it, the only um, thing that I could find about the mortality of people, it was a ridiculously small number of people who, let's say that it was like 1.8% of the entire population that had developed heart related problems and passed as a result of it. 1.8. So that might have, out of 20,000 people, it wasn't thousands of people that actually died. They were saying that there was a group in the control group that developed these problems, but it was like 19 people who passed and only 8 passed in the other group. So it's like, wait a minute. So first of all, you got self-reporting by people you don't know who they are, you don't know what their metabolism is, you don't know what part of the country they live in, whether or not they're in a food desert, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It didn't stand any smell test at all to be published as a headline in the American Heart Association. I don't understand. And therefore, my skepticism of government agencies just hasn't gotten any better.
That's so interesting because I think that what ends up happening in, you know, when you when things get to be, let's say, and I don't want to say a fad, but let's say there's a way of thinking that gets to be out there.
Right,
I don't think anything is meant for everybody.
right.
I think that certain people do really well on intermittent fasting, and other people, that's not how their body works. It's almost like it's assuming everybody is the same, which we're not. And I do believe that for certain groups of people, I think intermittent fasting works really well, like that,
Yes,
or limiting your food window, consumption window. I do that. I mean, I limit, but not excessively. I just know that one, I feel better if I don't eat really late at night. I
right.
feel I feel yucky, or if I eat too late and then go to bed. I mean, it's
Yes.
just I just and and so I just think that we make these assumptions and we kind of try to apply it to the general or every single person in the world or every single person in our country or whatever. And then you have to step back. And when we were got on earlier, one of the things we ended up with was actually trying to look for the signs of how do you feel when you do something. And how do you monitor, for example, progress or lack of progress or those kind of things. And so I think sometimes we make these very broad statements, and it's like I'm a vegetarian. I've been a vegetarian, well, I'm a vegan now almost, but I've been a vegetarian for 35 years, I figured out the other day. And I've been told by people, by functional medicine doctors, lifestyle medicine doctors, I now have a functional medicine MD who takes a lot of nutrition into account, and I have a PCP. And I've been told by numerous practitioners through the years that I'm a good vegetarian. Like I'm supposed to be a vegetarian. I also feel really good but not everybody is meant not to have meat in their diet. Some people need
Agreed.
it. And
Yes.
so I think making sort of like these broad assumptions for everybody is just wrong. I think that people have to start to look at it and say, okay, well, how do I feel? And does it feel right to me? And what happens when I eat only meat or I only eat, I don't eat meat, animal protein and things like that. And I think we're so trained not to pay attention.
Yeah. While you're speaking, I can't help but think these are elite rich man's problems because most of the rest of the world is lucky if they get one meal a day, you know? And so the when do they eat? When it's in front of them. And it's got nothing to do with that. And what's their incidence of obesity and diabetes and all the rest of that sort of stuff? It's always assumed in our culture that if you're going to change your routine, whether it's physical exercise or you're changing diet, or if you're going, from a situation where you have been doing anything for a while, or getting off of patent drugs or prescriptions or that sort of thing. It's a bad idea to just stop steroids cold. You've got to really have a way to manage that. And so I agree with you. You should have a doctor's opinion before you start doing anything that's a dramatic departure from what you've been doing. And in the meantime, there is clinical absolute studies that have been done that show a high correlation of people who were pre-diabetic who absolutely put that to rest for the rest of their lives by limiting the time during the day, but when they took in certain foods. And they also found that by eating things at a sensible level, and that means you're going from when you're pre-diabetic, it's quite possible that you've gotten into a habit of eating well past when you're full, and developing that sensitivity to, I don't really need any more food right now. That actually feeds right into having two meals a day that are somewhere between 5 and 8 hours apart, because you're going to be hungry by the time it's time to have the second meal. And then when you're full, you're going to necessarily be eating less than you used to when you were putting on 15, 20, 30 pounds in a quarter.
Right. It was interesting because I was having this conversation with a client the other day, and we were talking about her dog. And I was trying to diplomatically tell her that she should really, her dog is really overweight and she really needs to, like, it's not going to be good. I mean, the dog is very clearly prematurely aging, um, at the age of 10, where it's very stiff, like almost. And so I said to her, first of all, in the wild, animals don't eat every day. Like, and they don't have food available 24 hours a day. And I mean, Tonka doesn't get food 24 hours a day. There's mealtime, there's breakfast, and there's dinner. And maybe he gets a cookie or a treat in the middle of the day at some point, if like he does a trick or I tell him to sit and he stays or whatever. But it's not like it's great. He grazes all day. And I think it's clear that we all know, whether it's not even whether, like, pre-diabetic or not, carrying more weight is harder on your joints. It's, there's a number of risk factors for a number of things besides for diabetes. And now we have animals developing the same conditions that humans develop. I mean, and to me, you have to look at that, because who controls their diet? We do, and so if you want to look to, I think that we're no different. Yes, we're human beings, and yes, we require probably food to, for the brain to function, and hydration, obviously, and healthy fats and all these different things. But there's a difference between feeding your body what it needs, and I mean, don't get me wrong, the whole food situation is very complicated, because socialization and, and all those different things, we're very used to gathering around a meal table at to kind of, when there's a great occasion or when there's not a great, in a sorrowful occasion, that time when you spend sharing bread, so to speak, the old, kind of an old verbiage, is very vital. But I do think there is something to one. Well, what is food quality, and what are you eating? Like you mentioned, it's like, are you eating whole foods, and are you eating, or are you eating processed foods, which, have really no nutritional value at all? Um,
Yeah, and you can take that out to the nth degree, but I really liked what you said. I think the whole issue of, are you hydrating, is far more important than how many calories worth of food you're putting in your body on a daily basis. Most people are dehydrated, and when they feel like they're hungry and having hunger pangs, it's either because they have a a high carbohydrate diet and they've run out of carbs, which they get burned right now. Fat's a keep on giving kind of a thing, that once you've got the fat cells there and your carbs are gone, and if you're not eating at a regular time over a period of, I don't know, it takes usually about 12 hours or so before you go into the fat burning stages. And if you can maintain that state for 5 or 6 hours, then eat, and you do that over time. But the caveats to all of this is, you have to pay attention. Don't put your body at risk, and do not starve yourself. It's the wrong messages to send, because when you actually are starving your body, what happens is it doesn't burn fat anymore. It basically says, we're not eating enough. we don't know when our next meal is going to be coming from, and it goes into producing insulin and keeps it from actually metabolizing. You want to have this like nice little thing going on with your body where you're keeping it super hydrated on a daily basis. I drink. This is funny. My wife says if she drank what I drink on a daily basis, which is typically between 120 and 140 ounces of liquid, she said she would be nowhere other than in the bathroom, going to the bathroom all day long. And maybe yes, maybe not, but I've always felt like the hydration portion of it, especially when I used to camp when I was a kid,
Mhm.
we ate 2 meals a day back in those days. We didn't have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Our first meal would probably be at 11 o'clock in the morning, and our second one would be before it got dark at night. And then we do the campfire thing for the rest of the evening. And, it wasn't about diet and trying to do anything in particular, but it's just how we rolled. And so we do that for 2 weeks at a time. Almost always, I came back in really great physical condition. And that's probably the closest to having a six pack I ever had.
Mhm. Yeah, and for me, so much of what you're saying resonates because I think that when you were talking about hydration and the fact of, most are, and then I recently went to a talk given by a woman who was a nutritional psychologist. So she's like I guess a psychologist or psychotherapist that actually focuses quite a bit on nutrition. And so it was very interesting because obviously she got into the whole, started to explore or focus on diet and mental health, and which I think most of us think of diet and we think of physical health. We think of heart disease, we think of being pre diabetic. I don't know that we necessarily kind of go to our mental and emotional health when we think about food. I
Right.
mean, yes, for me and the people that I usually work with, yes, we do because we sit there and we kind of say, okay, when I'm stressed or when I'm stressed, I eat, or when I'm stressed, I don't eat. So in that way we do, but not in the fact of like what I'm actually putting in is affecting my mood. And one of the things she talked about is that most people in our country are protein deficient, that we need a lot more protein than a lot of us tend to eat. Because if you think about, you know if you think about the average, everyday breakfast, like I'm not talking about the occasion where you have like a brunch on the weekends where you might be getting eggs and whatever other forms of animal protein,
Right.
but you're eating basically carbs and sugar for breakfast. The average, let's say American, who's eating cereal and oatmeal and like, and I'm not saying those food, I don't want to label those foods are good or bad, but they're obviously not very protein rich,
Right.
except for maybe, milk, which, when you think about it, has calcium, a lot of other things, and it has, but it doesn't have a huge amount. So we tend to be protein deprived. And she talked about her findings as far as like what she finds as far as people, with certain severe mental and emotional issues, having like consuming far too little protein. And so it was really interesting. I mean, I've now gone on to listen to a few other people and a few other things on different diet factors and mental health and emotional health. But all of a sudden, I think I'm looking at nutrition differently even than I used to, because I really did kind of equate it with physical health. I kind
Yes.
of used to think, oh, okay, well, yes, physically, I want to, heart disease and diabetes and weight and joints and things like that, and inflammation and things like that. But I don't really think I thought about it in regard to mental health and emotional health.
Yeah, and it's really important because if you think about what food actually is, your body regards it as as a complex drug. it is sending signals to start different processes in your body. And
Mhm.
as geeking out as we're doing right now, I think most people are staying with it okay. But I think the primary message here is, as I heard you say a few different times today, you started hearing something that kind of piqued your curiosity and interest, and then from there, that's when you started going and listening to more about it, or hearing different speakers on the subject. And the neat part of that is that you may have to listen to or read maybe a dozen, if you're really settling in on a topic that's important in your life, you're going to have to read as much as you can, because you may find even the people that agree on some things don't agree on everything. And those things they don't agree on are almost more important than the things they do agree on. And by hearing that disagreement, it really gives you the opportunity to do a better job of making decisions and being responsible for yourself.
Absolutely. And I think that absolutely, because I think that what ends up happening is, I always look at my health now, my mental health, emotional health, as I'm just this experiment. And I need to figure out what works and doesn't work for me. So
Hmm.
I make a change. I'm very, that scientist in me kicks in. I never make a lot of changes all at once, because if I feel a certain way, I don't know what was the cause. So I'm never quick to rush into doing, like, like taking six new supplements at the same time or whatever. That's just not going to be me. I'm going to sit there and say, okay, well, let me do this a little bit systematically, because otherwise, I won't know what really it is. And so I really look at it. I'm like, okay, I did this. How do I feel? How did I sleep? You know, all the different normal everyday things, which we all do. And
Yeah.
and is it equated to the, like, could it possibly? And then, because I never think anything's by accident. So if I do something new and something happens, yes, could it be a fluke? Yeah. But I don't necessarily give up right away. I sit there and I'm like, okay, well, let me see what happens, give it a few days. Let me see what if I do it again
Yeah.
and I get the same result, kind of thing.
Well, it's funny because well, while we're talking about it, is you get a piece of data or something you think is kind of important. And for example, I've gone into my doctor's office for my annual physicals, uh,
Hmm.
and that's the only place where I ever get my blood pressure taken, right?
Hmm.
And so last year I went in, and for some reason it was reading high, and I mean much higher than I've experienced, because for years my blood pressure has been 130, 135, maybe 140 tops, over 82, sometimes 80, in the 70s to high 80s, right? So I go in and they took my blood pressure, and it was like 178 over 95. And I said, this thing's on drugs. I mean, there's just no way that that's an accurate indication of what my general health is. So I said, what are the kinds of things that could skew this? And the doctor said, well, if you had consumed alcohol to any quantity last evening or over the last few days, that might have something to do with it. Um, we really do want to have you check this at home. So we went on Amazon and we bought a $20 blood pressure cuff. Right, it's the
Hmm.
coolest little thing, and it not only took my blood pressure and my diastolic and systolic numbers, and then also my beats per minute and all that good stuff. Did all that stuff and it recorded it. So at the end of a month, she asked me to come back so she could check me out again. When I walked in and I sat down, I was in a different examining room, right? And when they did the blood pressure, it was 133 over 78. Okay. And I said, what do you think? And she said, well, where's your data? And I said, "You're going to like this," because I had a month's worth of data doing my blood pressure 3 times a day. And do you know how many times I had a high reading? 3 times, when I intentionally tried to get my blood pressure up just
Mhm,
so I could see whether it was possible to do so, and
mhm.
I did. And I showed her the input. Here it is. It's 138, it's over 70. Here it is. It's 82, 145 over 82, and nothing any higher than 145, 147. And she goes, "This is amazing." And I said, "You want to do it, really have some fun? Let's go back into the other examining room.
Right, exactly.
Let's try that blood pressure machine and see what it says." She says, "We don't need to. We know you just have there's some kind of energy around you that causes the thing to go haywire."
Well, know, I was with my when I was with my mom last, my mother's blood pressure is usually really good, and it was really, I think it was really low, like really low. And I'm looking at it, and and sometimes I wonder whether those automatic machines, whether they should take out the old fashioned, like, the cuff with the stethoscope and put it under whatever.
Yeah.
So the doctor walks in and looks and says, if your blood pressure was that low, you would be on the floor right now. Like you wouldn't even be sitting up, kind of thing, like, but, and, so sometimes, they do, it's like every piece of equipment and everything that happens. But yeah, is like those things are kind of interesting. And the fact that, you know, the
Well, I
fact
got
that
to.
the doctor kind of looked at her and kind of said, okay, well, we know that's wrong. you know.
I'll tell you what, you just reminded me of a story. My best friend who passed last year. He had a situation where um, they were planning on putting a pacemaker in, right? And so he would go over every other day, and he'd go to CVS down there and do his blood pressure. So he walks into the place, and the thing goes off, and it gives these red numbers and everything, and calls the pharmacist over. He says, "What does this mean?" And she said, "You're not well. You need to get to the doctor's office as soon as possible." He says, "Well, funny enough, I've got an appointment there in a half hour." She said, "No, you need to go right now." So he goes over there, and the doctor does his blood pressure as he walks through the door. And his doctor says, "Bob, you cannot be awake right now. You should be unconscious on the floor." It was coming through at something like 98 over 60 or something
And
like that.
my mother's was lower
So
on hers.
so whatever it was like off the scale. And Bob was, let me put it to you this way. He had your build. He did not carry an ounce of fat anywhere. And so they get in the car. The doctor stops everything. He walks out the front door with Bob, gets into Bob's car, which is a manual shift. He says, "I'm driving." And Bob says, "Okay, you know how to drive a manual?" He says, "I do not." He said, "Okay, well, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you when to push that clutch in. You're going to do it, and I'm going to put it in gear." And that's how they got over to the emergency room. Funny story, but it's a true one, and he just loved telling it too. So the
Well, but to get back to our, I think it's just so important to start to ask questions, to pay attention, to start to, look at things with like this, and I want to say with this critical eye. We were talking earlier.
curiosity is a good thing, right?
I'm sorry. For
Curiosity is a very,
yeah,
very good. Curious mind is a very powerful thing. It's a good habit to use.
and to start to look at things that you read. Um, well, because I remember when I was working at Cornell, I had a really close friend, and if you ever look at symptoms. At that time, the internet wasn't as big. I mean, it was there, but it wasn't as big as now. And if you ever look at, let's say, the basic symptoms to every illness, they're all the same, like fatigue, muscle aches and soreness, you know, whatever. But they're all like they all sound. And I remember a friend of mine coming in one day swearing, like she was one of my coworkers, swearing that she had some really severe autoimmune disease. And I looked at her and I said, Anne, you don't have that. But it's true. And I think, having spent so much time in the sciences and in grad school, it's like you read that and you think you have every disease because you read them and they all sound the same. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm dying, kind of thing, because they all sound the same. But I think it's very easy. One is it's very easy to ignore things because one is that's not encouraged. And, and it's also that a lot of people don't have anybody to share it with. So, or they feel silly sharing it. But I think it is warranted to actually start to look at those things. And I find that really useful things. And I used to tell people to keep a diary, and that sounds like people think it has to be long and elaborate. And I'm like, no, could be like you write down, there are three things you're looking at. Maybe, you sit there and say, okay, maybe it's, sleep, um, you know, if you're getting headaches, for example, if you got a headache and you didn't get a headache,
Right.
you know, and you just start to follow it through and try to create, jot down and see if you see patterns. Like, and second of all, like you had those readings for your doctor. A friend of mine who does work in the more traditional medical realm said there's a difference of when you go in to see someone and you just kind of say, well, I've been feeling like that, but you don't have any sort of data or information to substantiate it.
Right.
It's just you telling them versus if you go in with a table that says, okay, and over the last month, I had a headache, let's say, 20 out of 30 days, and so then, you can show them how often it's happening and things like that, which, when they look at data or something like that, I think they pay a little bit more attention.
Yeah, it's powerful to have something that's variable data is a lot different than telling a story. So, and the other thing that I was kind of keep coming back to, my doctor's approach, and also some holistic folks that I've talked with. It's all inflammation. It's just a question of which of your organs is inflamed, and which ones are complaining at the time in terms of what your symptoms are. But they're all pretty much treatable about the same way. uh, and most of the time it has everything to do with just being responsible and working in a tight range for a little while. And then once you've got it sorted out, it's amazing how resilient the body is and how much it wants to return to a state of stasis, where where it's in good shape, where it's in charge of its own highs and lows, if you will, as long as you're not beating yourself up, physically or with substances.
Right. No, I agree with you that I think, and sometimes it's not so easy. Like I'm dealing with something right now that's like I'm working really hard to figure out, and I haven't been able to figure out so far. Yeah, do I get frustrated sometimes? Yeah, I get frustrated. I'm like, oh, this is so annoying because I can't figure out, let's say, the cause of whatever it is. And I continue on. I'm just like, you know, just got to figure it out. I mean, because I don't want to suffer, and I don't want to, I don't want to, whatever it is, I don't want to have these symptoms or whatever it is. And so, but it doesn't stop me. I'm still like, okay, eventually I'll figure it out.
I like all of the things where we're dealing in observable and measurable facts. And it's kind of a simple process in our culture that how we greet people, the first thing we say is, "How you doing?" Right? And then the answer is almost 95 out of 100 times, it's predictable. It's either, "Well, I'm doing okay," or, "Well, I got this one thing going on." But more often than not, it never gets into the well, I'm really glad you asked me that because I've been noticing something and I've been paying attention to it and gathering some information. And I'd be real interested in what your thoughts are about the information that I've gathered so far. Maybe you can tell me how to gather better information. We just don't have that conversation very often, do we?
No, not at all. And no, not really. I mean, I think there are certain people in my life where I have that conversation with, who I really know that um they are a critical thinker.
Yep.
And so I will sit there and I have a few friends who I'm really close with who I'll sit there and say, okay, this is what's going on. Or do you have any suggestions? Because this is going on, this has been going on too long or whatever.
Well, so we had that conversation so that we can have another one. And I think really, if there were some way that we could basically say, as you're going about your life, things are going to happen. But what if what you think is happening is not really what's going on? What if you just started using all of your senses to gather more information and data about what really is going on around you? And I love this conversation that we got into on Facebook. One of the memes that I put up, and it was something to the effect of, um, when you listen, please give your attention to the person speaking and not just merely wait your turn.
Mm,
And so we had, this was a lot of comments on it. And we come by that honestly, in my opinion, because if you think about it, the first time that we were in groups, or when I was, it was, probably in a classroom situation, and all the kids are talking at the same time. And the teacher says, what did the teacher say? Wait your turn. We didn't get any instruction on how to listen. We didn't get any instruction on taking in what is being said for understanding. And can you imagine how the whole thing would shift if the teacher just basically said, little Johnny, who's talking right now, is going to give you the keys to the kingdom. Whatever comes out of Johnny's mouth is likely to be the most profound thing you've ever heard. Let's just see if y'all can listen for it. And then when we're done, let's see who can do the best job of recreating exactly what little Johnny said it and what he meant.
right. I love
And then
that.
when we're done with that, whoever is the closest or can explain exactly what little Johnny meant and how he felt about it and all that good stuff will get a gold star. Can you even imagine how that might shift the conversation for adults all
Oh
those
my,
years later?
all those years later. And I just was having this conversation earlier with a new friend, and we were talking about that whole idea of listening and how it is a learned skill that I actually have to share with him. And I said that I would send it to him. I listened to a talk that Krista Tippett from On Being gave to Google titled The Art of Generous Listening. And
Yeah.
it was awesome. And it isn't something we're taught in school at all. Like you said, are, in school or even in family life, if you grow up with more than one sibling, and basically you want your turn and you talk over each other or whatever. And depending on, whether your parents said anything, but in general, it's not something we ever grow up thinking about really until, I don't know. I think when you do what I do and you do, Bill, and then all of a sudden you realize that basically you're listening for a career, like you're listening for, you know, I want to say a job, but it's not a job for, for whatever kind of fills your heart. You're listening to people, and then all of a sudden you realize how the importance.
Sure.
Because if you
Sure.
think about it, really, the only thing any of us wants is really to be heard. That's what we all want. I
Yeah.
mean, we want a place where we want to go to a place where we feel like we're heard and somebody is listening to us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think just knowing what heard means, there's a long conversation that can go into kind of distinguishing what someone being heard shows up like, you know? How will you know if you're being heard? How will you know if you heard someone? And that's where you kind of have to get into that going back and forth of negotiating on what the language means, so that you can approximate the feeling that's being sent along with the words that you think you're hearing. But the first stage of that is being able to just give back to somebody exactly what they said in their language before you try to ask them if that's what it means, because you can't define something using the terms that are, in the topic. It's like, for instance, like these days, you get people who say, well, hunger is when you're feeling hungry, okay, or something like that. That's not useful. There's nothing there. It's self-pointing, and it's really frustrating. No, I know. I mean, what's hunger mean? What is hunger? Well, there's different kinds of hunger.
Well, and also I think hungry means different things for different people. And since we have different body sensations and different sort of I, we and that's when language gets to be fun. So I'm on an audio event every week with my dear friend Solara where we talk about topics. And so for the month of March, it was Nutrition Awareness Month. So we talked about nutrition,
Yep.
but we got into this whole idea of nourishment and what is like, and so there's a lot of things that nourish us that aren't necessarily food.
Right.
Yeah. And this whole idea of how like, and so it was just this new outlook of what it feels to be nourished. And some people might take that as like what makes me feel full and complete and whole, what what people are around me, that kind of thing, as opposed to physical food. And so it's just the same thing when you use the word, like the word hunger, you know the whole idea of feeling depleted or deprived of something, and that might not be food, that
Yeah.
might be company, that might be a friend,
Yeah.
that might be, so hunger takes on a lot, or a word can take on very different meanings for different people, depending on their experiences in life and the way they grew up.
And that's where listening for understanding is so important. For instance, the word hunger. I can remember when I was a small child. I probably was 7 or 8 years old, and my dad bought the Barbara Streisand album, "The People." Do you remember that song? The lyrics to the song are, you know, uh, people who need people. They're the luckiest people in the world.
Mhm.
We finally get through all of the verses and everything, and at the end of it, she's singing, "No more hunger and thirst, but first be a person who needs people." And so I didn't know what the word was, but I asked my mom. I said, "Is she talking about something that has nothing to do with food and water?" She said, "That's right." And so it was a metaphor in that case, and to understand that at the age of 8, it was way over my head. But I knew she wasn't talking about going to McDonald's. Okay.
Right. I love that. And I had forgotten about that song. But that's, I love that story because it just reminds me of, trying to articulate emotions from in children and what it means when the questions they ask and everything. I mean, I remember, we both have had, loss, people who've passed over the past year. And just hearing from like my nieces and nephews, my great nieces and nephews, or being around a client who had a loss and her grandson was over.
Yeah.
And just the questions they ask were which are so ingenious, but and you have to figure out the best way to answer them because you want them to feel like you've heard them and that and that you're listening. Like you don't want to just push it off as a silly question.
Right.
I remember my niece when my sister-in-law's father passed away. She was at the house. My niece was like 2 or 3, something but young. It might have been a little older. And she was cleaning out his clothes. And my niece turned to her and said, "Well, won't grandpa need his clothes in heaven? Like he can't walk, like he can't walk around naked, like kind of thing." And it was just such an interesting, like it wasn't something, it was like for her, she was like looking at all these clothes that were going away. And she's like, "Well, what's he gonna wear if you're taking away all his clothes?" Kind of thing. And so it was just like it was sweet. It was like, how do you answer that? You know, without like with a satisfying answer, with an answer that'll satisfy them. So it's just so appropriate. And I think that part of the issue with listening is the fact that we so a lot of the time are so out of touch with our own feelings and our own emotions.
Yep.
We have a hard time um articulating and listening with any sort of presence and understanding of someone else.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, the truth is, we are far more interesting to ourselves than anybody else we're speaking with for the most part, right? They're transient. They're going to be here for a few minutes and then gone. We're not going to go anywhere. We will always be everywhere we are.
Everywhere we are, right? But there is, but as you're saying that, it's really true. And this is I know our dear friend Kay Mullison, who has a podcast um with Exfadio too. And it's really interesting because I'm speaking at a grief conference for that Kate is organizing at the end of August. And I'm really about getting to know oneself. Basically, I'm being present for you.
Yep.
And the art of generous listening for yourself. Like, what does that look like? And I mean, can we sit with some of those things, the questions, the challenges that we have? Can we look at that? And can we look beyond the surface? Because I
Yeah.
think if we look beyond the surface, then we have something. We look beyond the surface of what someone is saying.
Well, I definitely like this self because unfortunately, most people think the thoughts that they're having is who they are, as opposed to the thoughts they're having. And I've talked about it many times. Back in the 1990s, I went through a couple of years of training with this company called Landmark Education. And
Mhm.
one of the exercises that we did at one point, which was basically to kind of get that awareness and being present, and also being noticing when things are quiet. That first of all, you can't shut your mind off. It's impossible. Don't have a thought. Okay, no, forget it. You're done. You're gonna have thoughts. But the exercise was called "Listen to Yourself." Listen to the thoughts that you're having and question what those thoughts, first of all, what they mean. Second of all, whose thoughts are they? Are they yours Or is it something that's kind of like this recurring theme that comes up every day out of the 80,000 thoughts that we have? Most of that is not spontaneous generation of intellect, okay? And most of it, especially if it's negative, is not our most inspired thinking, right? So when you listen to yourself listen, that means sometimes you start to hear an automatic response or a trigger that you have when somebody else is speaking, somebody who you know, somebody who you think you know what they're going to say, and on and on and on it goes. But it's an opportunity then to verbalize with a partner, like, here's what was going on in my head while I was having thoughts. And quite frankly, I do realize that I can't actually control the thought. However, you get to a place where you start to say, I can perhaps do something about my response to the thought. Or maybe I can do something about the line of thinking of that thought. And, and it's really powerful from the standpoint of, people who wake up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and can't go back to sleep. It's because they think and they empower, the importance of whatever thoughts are keeping them awake and feel like they have to resolve those before they can go to sleep.
Hmm.
You don't have to.
And I remember one of the exercises that I had to do. I remember when I first started to meditate with one of my meditation teachers, was to even just notice your pattern. So, are you, let's say, excessively focusing on past, or are you going to the future? Like, what is your habit? And and maybe it's just in that moment of being quiet, but just noticing that pattern, like, and you'll have weeks where, let's say, probably something's bothering you, where that happened, like, the week before, and you keep on going back there, and you keep on going back there, and you keep on going back there. And I think when I started to look at that, I started to realize how much I wasn't present, like in the present moment. And then you realize, you're like, oh, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about something that happened that I really obviously I can't do anything about anymore. I could, I might be able to do something as a result, write a note, apologize, or whatever. But the actual event I cannot change. It happened. And just noticing that. And it was just such an interesting exercise. I remember in the beginning, as I sat there, and literally we'd have to sit there and go past, 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 future, just like in our heads of like where it was going, and
Right.
training yourself to try to stay present.
Yeah.
And so it was so interesting in the beginning because I don't think I realized how much I wasn't present.
Yeah. For most people, it's about 96% of the time.
Right.
They're good
And
at faking it. I mean, I've always had a talent for no matter what I was thinking about. Somebody would say, well, you're not listening to me at all. And I would answer them back and I'd say, yes, I will. You were just telling me about your car and how much, it's a nuisance for you that you have to take it in every 6 months to get it looked at. And beyond that, I really was very good at recalling what they had to say. However, I was not in the conversation. What I was thinking and doing was far more important than anything that they might have to talk about.
right, right. And so it's always interesting when you kind of start to look at that about yourself. And there are
Exactly.
different, I was on this morning talking about some books, and I said, and it is a muscle like any muscle. The more you use it, the more you focus on trying to stay present or truly listening to people, the easier it gets. And
Yeah.
yes, I agree. We are, especially these days, surrounded by 1,000 different distractions, and it's very easy. We have the bing, the little signals from, the messages of all the beeps that we get on everything.
Yeah.
From our cell phone to email to whatever else that you're in, so that you hear the alarms that go off from appliances in your home that bing and then distract, so we have a lot of things that distracts us out.
including headlines, you know?
That's right, and so we just have to, and so it really is this training. I know. What's up, buddy? It's getting a little dark.
Yeah, it definitely is getting dark out there, isn't it?
Yeah, got a little shifted. So on this
So
solar eclipse day.
so the takeaway here is that there's always room to explore with a curious mind this whole notion of being present. What does that look like? And the access and the important energy that you get by learning how to listen to yourself listen is that when you notice that you're drifting off into the ozone, having your own thoughts about the past or the future, which we're kind of thrown to do that, right? We don't ask anybody to vote on it. That's just what we do. But you can have a choice in that moment to come back and refocus your attention on the here and now. And when you get really good at that, then you don't have to fake, and pick up this parlor trick of being able to say what people are saying while you're thinking about something else. You actually can engage and you actually can take it on board. And then you can contribute something with some sincerity and mass to what it was that they were talking about by asking a question, maybe as opposed to just agreeing and then say what you would say anyway.
Right. And I think that, I was having this I was listening to I was on a meeting last Wednesday with a friend of mine, two people, on it was on conflict and resolving conflict and things like that. And it was a really great conversation. And one of the things, we were talking about was when you're in the heat of something and you get very wrapped up, like, something, you're in a conflict, you're in your own story, in your own, you're in that whole defense place of, and it's almost like your ability to hear gets shut off, that ability is actually pausing for a moment and saying, I'm really sorry. I was kind of wrapped up in my own story for a moment. Could you repeat what you said?
Yep.
Because I think that a lot of the time it's almost like we're not focused, and then we don't want to say we weren't focused on what the person is saying. And then we kind of fake it. And the person doesn't feel heard, which makes the situation or makes it, they are not supported, and kind of owning up and saying, I'm really sorry I got distracted.
And there's nothing wrong with saying what's so. I mean,
Right,
we
exactly.
are human beings, and
That's
I
right.
wasn't listening to you, but I want to now.
Right,
And so
exactly.
forgive me. And do you mind telling me that in different words?
Sorry, Tonka was barking, can you, can you repeat that, please? Kind of thing, which, happens, so probably more
It
times.
does.
It does. It's just life.
Yeah, squirrel.
Squirrel, exactly. Squirrel. That's what I always say, squirrel.
Yeah, yeah. That
Mhm.
my one of my new favorite memes on Facebook is I went into the kitchen to get something, and I'll be damned if I can remember what it was. But then I came back outside again to so I could remember what it was that I needed to go back into the kitchen, and then I forgot why I came out of the kitchen back into the living room again, and now I have to pee.
Right, exactly. Life.
So let me ask you a question here. We're holy mackerel. We're almost, you
Um,
know, a quarter of the way through April. And
mhm.
you're one of my stalwarts for picking a theme for the year. And I don't recall you doing that for 2024. You were very big about it in 2023. And what is kind of crossing my mind right now, what I want to ask you is that now you have the experience that you've got in 2024, whether or not you said something in the first week or the first month of 2024, that's really not all that important to me. But what focus, um, issue or topic would be front of mind for you at this point?
Well, I really am um, very heavily kind of invested as far as my own think my own self and with my clients on this
Right.
whole idea of nutrition and mental health. Uh, that's on a kind of, verbiage goal type level. Last year it was inspired action. And this year I kind of just slightly varied that to spirited action because I was thinking of my dad, who passed, and the fact that he be present, like with me throughout this next year as I became active. And when I think about it, it's very much connected because my father, in the end, as you know, was somewhat diagnosed with dementia.
Yep.
And so when I think about mental health and longevity and all those things, it kind of makes sense that, even indirectly, even though it wasn't planned, of course, that is what I'm now all of a sudden focused on. And I'm like, see, there is never any accidents, whether I kind of molded myself to kind of choose that as a passion, but that is really where I'm going um over the next year.
Well, I support that. I think it makes an awful lot of sense. And I think you are a thought leader in that area to begin with. And I can't wait to see how 2024 plays for you.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Thank you. Yeah, it's such a, like, I find it fascinating. A fascinating thing to think about because I think about it in regards to aging, but I also think about it in regard to children, you
Yep.
know, and scholastic development and what that means as far as, oh, sorry, what that means regard to, school age children who are in school all day
Yep.
and being nourished. And when I say, and that be physically and emotionally. So that's, it doesn't really have to be older or when we get older. Obviously, my clients tend to be more people that are, you know, not young children usually. But that doesn't mean I see the ramifications and I see the applicability. I think that's a word. As I said it, I'm
I believe it is. Yes.
like applicability is not really a word, but
Five
um,
five syllables. I think you won a prize.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So I think of the applicability of it across the board.
Yeah. Well, the neat thing about what we're doing right now, and I can tell the folks at home, while we are at this point, we're actually in my area at the maximum uh, eclipse period. 328. It was supposed to be the where the least amount of the sun is visible. So this is a great time spiritually. And it's going to take probably another hour for it to get back to normal sunlight again. But in the meantime, it's a really good time to just appreciate being indoors, being quiet, and
Mhm.
having this great conversation with you, my friend.
Yes, you too, Bill. And I agree. Very powerful time to set intentions and to send out, whatever it is you wish to manifest, positive, healing, whatever it is that you need right now, and frame it in a positive way.
Yep. It kind of I love our conversations because memories fire. And back in 1996, Jan and I went on an Alaska cruise, and our wedding anniversary is the 26th of June. So we were on that cruise for the summer solstice, and there were these really cool people that booked the cruise just so they could have a sunrise. And of course, you have to realize that that time of year, the sun never sets.
Mhm.
You get into a kind of like a gray period, almost like this eclipse. Uh, but you know, with the windows open in your stateroom, you can't sleep because it's just too bright, right? And they were out there doing all this chanting and doing all sorts of energy things, you know, on the deck at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, wherever you know the actual solstice time occurred. Let's put it that way. And it was very cool to have them language and talk about what they did later on. You know, like what were you guys up to today? And we were wishing peace to the world.
Mhm.
We were manifesting, you know, God's love. We were, you know, it's just really some wonderful things for me to recall now. You know, kind of fills me up and makes me feel very great. You know, just remembering that there are people out there that that would be their intention.
Mhm. I love that, Bill. And this whole idea of, yeah, I absolutely love that, of sending out peace into the world. Like what better desire or intention um could you send out? Um
What better indeed?
and so that's no, I mean, I think that's remarkable. And it reminds me of when you were describing it. I remember when I went to Sweden, the same thing. It was in the middle of July. And basically, it never really totally gets dark. There's always like this tinge of light that happens in Scotland too. I remember when I was there. And so it'd be 11 o'clock, midnight, and it wasn't really blackout. It was like kind of like it was almost like the sky was like a whitish almost all the time. Like, and it's just so interesting because you know it's like 11 p.m. or midnight or 1 o'clock. And
Yes,
you're like, yeah, but it's not really dark.
yes. Well, and that's the other really cool thing too, is that people think that time occurs at midnight, you know? And it's even astrology folks, when you explain to them that when astrology was being determined, you know, thousands of years ago and then refined over, we're on a different clock than they had back in those days. And in fact, we're not even quite sure what time midnight was in the 1500s, you know? So when you're thinking of it in terms of like where the day gets divided, these folks had the science down to 5:37 in the morning is the exact moment of the solstice, you know, and that's where the prayer is going to be the most powerful and be the most projected into the world and the universe. And
Hmm.
that's the kind of level of intentionality about doing good things that's either, you know, pretty geekish, which is cool, or it's really intentional in terms about manifesting things in the world.
Hmm.
And maybe it's a little of both. And I think that's still pretty good.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So we're kind of at that point, my friend, where we probably should think about summarizing, maybe throwing a little cherry on top here, or any other thoughts that you think would be good to put out in the world today.
Just if if you really feel at a loss about what to do, um, reach out to someone. Feel free to connect with Bill and myself. I mean, just for conversation, sometimes those conversations can be the most powerful. Also, I love that, we tend to want to talk to the people that we know and love. And that's great if you have those people in your life. Sometimes we don't. And sometimes those are actually the people that you don't want to speak to
Right.
because they have um, their own agenda and their own ideas. And I know that for myself is people in my life see me how they've always seen me a lot of the time. Even though I've changed quite a bit.
Sure.
But so I think that sometimes going to somebody who's objective, who doesn't have you don't have like a long history with, or you don't have that with, is actually very helpful in addition to going to the people who you know and love.
Yeah, fresh perspective where there's not already a historical presupposed notion on both directions.
Absolutely.
I like it a lot. I really do. So, anything else to just kind of
Come back next week. Who knows what we'll talk about?
we sure as hell don't. And I like it. It's how we stay young and fresh, my friend.
Absolutely.
So let me just remind all of you, it's not just Bill and Jan. We're lighting the candle, and we're creating a world that works. And you're part of it, and your listening is very, very key to all of that happening and working. So bless you all, love you all, and have the best week ever. And thank you again, my dear friend Jan.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Have a great day.
You too. Bye bye for now.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, A World That Works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch every episode as well as the rest of the network at exvadio.com, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.